Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, wondering just when you're going to see a bigger royalty check from the Music Modernization Act, or else a scrappy upstart, wondering if it's actually worth it for YouTube to mail you a royalty check for 23 cents, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the first Friday of July 2020, and I thank you for joining us. This week's episode is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made. And a web developer was always some guy named Matthias who drove a Pontiac Aztek with murdered out windows and hubcaps, and who was always referencing the movie Gattaca and trying to sell you ecstasy. And old Matthias would charge you like $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. Listen, it's the future now, you guys. That's not how it works anymore. We can have nice things now. We don't have to deal with web developers anymore. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. Everything you need is there. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates. You can crowdfund commission-free there. You can do fan subscriptions commission-free there. It's a great service. Listeners to the Working Songwriter podcast can just put in TWS in the promo code box. That's the initials of our show, and you will get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Thank you, Bandzoogle, for sticking with us. If you'd like to hear some of my music in the coming months, you can tune in to my YouTube channel every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for The Song Show. This week, I'll be celebrating the songs of Lucinda Williams. We'll have a special guest visit from Texas singer-songwriter Carson McCone, and then I'll finish out the night, as always, by taking some requests and answering questions. So head on over to YouTube, search for Joe Pug channel, and then subscribe, and I'll see you there Sunday night. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, here's a few things that you could do to help. You could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you love and find meaningful. You head to their site, Patreon, and you search for The Working Songwriter, and you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for this show. It's basically a voluntary subscription. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in over there, it'd make a huge difference for me. So thanks for doing that. If you're not in a place where you can contribute financially, I totally get that. I've been there. There's a couple things that you could do, though, that would help us that are totally free. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store. Or secondly, you could just tell a friend about the show. And the simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. I will end all the harassment there. Kathleen Edwards is an absolute legend, and I am just over the moon. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. My guest this month is making a triumphant return to music after a nearly 6-year hiatus. Kathleen Edwards hails from Ottawa, Canada. She took the international roots music scene by storm with her debut album Failure in 2003, which was critically acclaimed. Since then, she's released a series of albums that have made her one of her generation's most influential songwriters. She's toured with John Mayer, Richard Buckner, Bob Dylan, and John Prine. She's recorded for Zoe, Maple Music Recordings, Rounder, and Dual Tone Records. She's been nominated for a host of Juno Awards, and her record Asking for Flowers was shortlisted for Canada's prestigious Polaris Music Prize. The New York Times has said of her, she sings in a voice that defies its own sweetness with wavering, raspy attacks or a deliberate turn away from the expected note. She's a scrapper through and through. Pitchfork has said that she possesses significant songwriting prowess, and NPR has said of her work, Edwards' lyrics suggest stories much bigger than can be contained in 3 or 4 minute songs, which tend to resonate long after the music stops. She was kind enough to jump on the phone with me last week to talk about her journey so far. Kathleen Edwards, thank you so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter podcast. You're Canadian, but your life growing up was a little bit different because your parents were civil servants in the Foreign Service. Can you talk about what was around you culturally growing up? What sort of music were you around? What were you exposed to that maybe other Canadians weren't?
Well, I have a really interesting musical background because of my parents, which is that my parents actually met singing in a choral group in Ottawa, where I still live today. Dad was a young Foreign Service officer, but he, in university, had probably other social ambitions, which was to, be Gordon Lightfoot musically and have the sex life of Leonard Cohen. So my dad was like the Saskatchewan boy about university campus. Just around the time that Joni had sort of left Saskatoon as well, and sort of her presence was sort of always kind of hinted at in his young life as well. But yeah, my mom and dad have a very funny, my dad was kind of like the folk singer. He's kind of like the guy who could have actually been cast in A Mighty Wind. And then my mom could have also done that, but she was much more technically talented. She certainly was a very accomplished pianist. And so then when I was about 4 or 5 years old, they say that I asked to start playing violin. My mom taught my brother and I briefly some piano. And then around the age of 10, I remember my dad's classical guitar ended up being something that I picked up and played a few chords on. And then it kind of just kept going from there. And I thankfully stayed in classical violin lessons until I was finished high school, which gave me a great musical knowledge foundation. But, I went to the dark side. So, anyway, so yeah, that's kind of what my young life was.
When you say you went to the dark side, you mean away from theory?
Well, I'm sure there's theory in rock and roll, but I certainly did fall in love with the songwriter culture of Tom Petty, Neil Young, and I became a summer camp kid, and that's where I learned the Canadian and North American songbook. Essentially, I learned songs that I didn't even know were John Prine songs, and I learned songs I didn't even know were Van Morrison songs, and then the Neil Young songbook, which every Canadian who goes to summer camp learns, and so that's kind of what I mean when I mean the dark side. But what's funny is that my parents there was such a strong presence of classical music in our home that I sought out a lot of that music on my own. And my brother was obviously an influence in his record collection, but so I had a bit of both. I was pretty lucky.
As someone who's a songwriter that doesn't know anything about classical music, what are 2 or 3 kind of foundational records that you think a novice songwriter could appreciate that are classical records or classical works?
Well, a big piece in my family is Handel's Messiah, which is a predominantly choral piece that for some reason is very popular around Christmas. Another one I particularly like that's actually a very Canadian sort of a very famous Canadian recording is Glenn Gould's Bach Sonatas. And Glenn Gould is he's a very iconic Canadian pianist, and he had a very unique style of playing piano, especially his interpretations of Bach, he was quite. I really hope that I'm not speaking out of turn, but or that I'm speaking incorrectly on this. But my understanding is that he had a very sort of percussive style of playing piano, where he was quite what's the word? He was quite direct in his style of playing keys, and so it really accentuated Bach's writing. And I always loved I love anything that's a Bach sonata. Some of them are made for violin, some of them are made for cello, and some of them are made for piano, and it was all music written for the church, essentially. But I find it to be incredibly moving in a way that Wagner is kind of just a little too much. It's like, let's put corn syrup on everything. Bach is a little bit more like, oh, I'll just dust this with a beautiful little bit of icing sugar. You know, he's really brilliant.
Got it.
And the third piece that I fell in love with in my young adult life was a Gorecki symphony number 3, I believe it is. And it's an absolutely stunning, slow-moving crescendo, essentially. And I think it takes about 10 minutes for like the almost silent beginning to become this sort of apex moment where a choral group enters and the sound volume peaks, and it's incredibly stirring and moving. And so those are I would say those are 3 good starting places.
Wow. And having to wait 10 minutes for a musical piece to actually get going in the year 2020, that's an absolutely revolutionary thing to do, I suppose.
Sure. I mean, that or just listen to Josh Ritter's, a couple of Josh Ritter's records.
Right. No, yeah, Josh has a few of those.
He has a few of those songs.
So you go over to, as you say, to the dark side. You decide not to go to college and just basically begin writing and gigging immediately. How supportive was your family of that? Were they down with it because they had kind of that bohemian beginning themselves, or were they worried about you and wanted you to go a different direction at that time?
Well, I can assure you, if my parents ever hear this, to hear themselves described as bohemian will flatter them beyond anything. They are definitely not bohemian, though they are very cool. And I think, I had a really wonderful thing happened around the first couple of years of me living on my own. First of all, I was fiercely hungry to play guitar at any open mic night, at any gig that I could get where I had to play covers for 3 hours. On the street, I would busk. And my mom really didn't particularly understand why it was that I was drawn to that. I think she felt that it was quite sort of not vulgar, but really she did not have context of her own to sort of appreciate why I was like that. And I didn't really know why I was like that. I just went for it. And then this wonderful thing happened where they didn't really get what I was doing. I think they were always kind of waiting for my, quote unquote gap year to end, which would just continue to go on and on. And my parents ended up, my dad was in the Foreign Service, and my parents ended up being posted overseas. And so I kind of had this incredible chance to be completely separate from my parents for a few years, where when you're at a certain stage in your young life and you have a good relationship with your parents and they want you to do well in life and they're probably involved in seeing you pick some sort of trajectory, them sort of having to live overseas and be absent from whatever it was I was going to get up to was probably really good for me, because I just got down to business and just played gigs, and I made a demo, and that demo became, a second demo, and that second demo became my first record, and I got signed to Rounder. And so I think it kind of just was this, there sort of in not getting it actually probably gave me a little bit of, it probably motivated me to not sit around and wait for the phone to ring, because I knew it wouldn't ring unless I went out there and did something about it. But also I wasn't sort of exposed to them going, yeah, that's great, honey, but when are you X and Y and Z, And right. I just had time and space to figure it out for myself.
So before we get to that first record, I want to talk a little bit more about that period right there where you have the self-pressed EP called Building 55, and you're kind of touring Canada on self-booked tours. Talk to me pre-internet 2.0 in that kind of world in the late 90s, early 2000s. What did it actually look like to book a tour back then?
Oh God. I honestly, I once in a blue moon, I think about this, and it makes me. I mean, first of all, it makes me feel so incredibly proud of myself, but it's also fucking hilarious. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anyone in the music scene. I didn't have an agent. I certainly didn't have a promoter that I knew in any town. And what I actually did was one of the communities in which I found sort of people and in the arts and music scene in Ottawa was through my local used instrument store, and it was called Songbird Music, and it's actually one of the places I bought some of my first instruments, or at least when I was upgrading to nicer instruments, it's where I would go and turn in my crappier instrument for a better one. And they were guys who had, a few of them had played in bands that toured across Canada or played in Toronto or had gigs here and there. And so I thought, well, if those are the guys who actually know things about the local music scene, as they did here in Ottawa, maybe then I just got to start calling music stores in other cities and find out, and I remember once I called there's a great music store that sold beautiful vintage guitars and all sorts of things in Edmonton, of all places. I remember calling and saying, hi, I'm from Ottawa, I'm a musician, and I want to basically book a tour, and I thought maybe I would call one of you guys and see what you think, where would I want to play if I came to town? This is what I kind of sound like. And a lot of times I had people go, oh, well, you want to talk to this guy, and this guy books that club, and blah, 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 and this person does a really cool. And suddenly I had all these little pieces of leads that I would just follow those leads up. And then before I knew it, I went away for 5 weeks, and, hilariously, I probably only played 10 shows, but I made it all the way from Ottawa to Victoria, which is, to the western coast of Canada, and came back, and yeah. And some of them actually ended up leading to other new opportunities. So it was kind of worth it.
That's so great. I got 2 young little kids, and if I could raise them to do anything, it would be like that sort of kind of self-starting mentality in their early 20s of like, I don't know anyone who knows how to do this, but I can think about how it would work, and I'll just try to figure it out. I mean, that's just such a, for lack of a better term, it's just such a winner's attitude, Yeah,
I honestly don't know where it came from. I really don't. I didn't think that I was hot shit. I just was kind of guess I had blinders on, and I just thought, well, I'm going to do this.
Talk to me then about the transition from that world to how did you end up signing with Rounder Records for Failure? How did all that end up coming together as a perfect storm?
Well, one of these demos that I started to make and then kept working on ended up being my first record, Failure. And one of the people in my town that I knew very well from years and years, we actually went to elementary school together, was a guy named Eric Hoffman. And Eric and I sort of would connect, and he'd go away and tour with a bunch of bands, and he'd come back to town. And I gave him a copy of Failure, saying, this is what I'm working on. He's like, oh, cool, man, I'll listen to it. And about a day later, he called me back, and he said, can you get me like 5 more copies of this? I'm going to give you a bunch of address. I want to send these out to a couple people I know. And I was like, cool, man, thanks. He would be the guy that, I couldn't even fathom, the kinds of gigs he was playing or the people that he must have known. Mm-hmm. He crossed over to the big time. And funny enough, I think at the time he was tour managing a woman from my region named Sarah Harmer, who was sort of, her star was rising, and so he ended up sending it to some of the people that she actually was working with. And one of them became my manager. And it was him who actually already had a relationship with Rounder, and he sent it to them. And I think they kind of went, we're in. I played South by Southwest and they saw me play. I played in an Indian food restaurant and it kind of just, they were developing that Zoe label. They had just signed, Sarah had just sort of had this great couple of years of success. And I think they were signing acts like the Cowboy Junkies and so it just kind of, my timing, I guess, was good, and they took me on.
Were those demos, did that become Failure, or they listened to those demos and they said, cool, go into the studio now and go ahead and remake that?
No, my manager, who became my manager, a guy named Patrick Sambrook, he heard Failure and said, I love this, I want to manage you. The first thing we got to do is we got to find somebody great to mix this record, because all the pieces are there. We just got to get somebody to clean some things up and, make it sound great. And so we did that. And then he shopped it around once we had those mixes done.
Okay. So it was just a remix. That album was like an out of the gates instant classic album. It reminds me of like John Prine, like that first album of his that just like set the tone for the rest of his career. How did that album, when it came out and its critical reception and then its popular reception by listeners all over the world, how did that change your life?
Oh, well, maybe to go back to sort of the beginnings of my relationship with my parents, it certainly woke them up to go, oh, she's actually doing something. Mm-hmm. Or this is actually good, or because they actually would get calls from friends of theirs going, your daughter's record is amazing, or did you just see the review and the blah, blah, blah. And then, I got very early on into that record, I got booked on Letterman. And in fact, I think I played on Letterman the week the record came out. So I must have been booked a few months in advance. And it kind of changed everything, which is funny to think, because nowadays playing on a late night or having, some kind of larger scale, like I could get booked on SNL tomorrow and it's not going to change my life. Right. It would be an incredible privilege to do and it would be exciting, but it's not going to break me. And back in the day, I feel like a late night TV show had especially Letterman, it had the potential to do that. And it did do that for me. And so, having said that, it's funny. It felt like it happened overnight. And at the same time, a year and a half later, I was still touring, and it didn't feel like I went from playing in my local little basement bar to, headlining 2,000 seat theaters. That didn't happen either. I opened in the fall of the year that record came out. I was opening for a band called Guster on a college circuit, mm-hmm. and they could have given two shits about my music, not Guster, but the crowd,
right.
I played a lot of gigs during that record coming out where I thought, am I beating my head against the wall here? Because sometimes you do things that stick and sometimes you do things that just fall flat.
Totally.
So it didn't really feel like this, my life changed. It kind of felt like, I knew these were great opportunities, and sometimes they really felt special, and sometimes they felt like work.
Yeah. And especially if you end up on like a package tour where you're opening for a band, and you can tell like from night one that it's just not going to be a fit with their audience. It's such a sinking feeling. To realize that.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? It's funny. I don't actually think I've ever had somebody say that to me. I think you might be the first person. Like I thought maybe it was just me and my circumstance, but that first night I knew. I thought, holy shit, I just committed to 6 weeks with this band and this is what it's going to be. And it's not the band, it was not them. It was like, oh my God, this is not the right audience for me to be playing in front of. It was really, I was devastated.
Yeah, I'm really skeptical as to opening tours, unless you're like a high energy party band as an opener, which, people can get into cold. I think that the only way it can really work if you're like a singer-songwriter is, my general rule now is if I'm going to go support is it has to be seated. It has to be a seated venue. I find that makes a huge difference. Otherwise, people, they just can't, God bless them, it's hard to hear 10 new songs all at once. You know what I mean? It really is.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's so true. Having said that, I had many years after that, maybe 6 or 7 years after that, I had the opportunity to open for John Mayer in arenas across Canada. And one of the reasons that I got that chance was because I switched agents, and the agent kind of said, well, if you come to our agency, you know, here I'm booking this John Mayer tour across Canada. And my manager was like, you have to do this. This is amazing. Thumbs up, thumbs up. And I was like, no, that's okay. Thanks very much. That does not sound like something I want to do.
Right.
And he and I went back and forth for several days about it. And he won the argument, and I agreed to do it. And it was an amazing tour for me to be on, because the type of audience that was listening to John Mayer were totally open to hearing me. And so, you know, it was one of those things you just never know.
Totally.
And I still play shows where people come up to me and say, hey, the first time I saw you was, you know, when you opened for John Mayer.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, no, you're right.
You just never know.
No, it can work. How did that season of touring more and getting on the road and getting into the business of music, how did that change creativity and songwriting for you in that period?
Well, I was really lucky that I was almost always in such great company. You know, I toured with bands like My Morning Jacket. I got to tour with Willie Nelson, John Prine. And I think being around people of that caliber and quality, it let me take myself seriously in a way that I really cared about the craft of songwriting. And Failure was kind of this record that was, you know, this girl living out in the boons, you know, driving her old Suburban, working as a waitress, kind of navigating, you know, first loves and heartbreaks and drinking too much and acting badly. And then I, you know, had all these opportunities, and I was kind of got to come to the, you know, sandbox with a bunch of grown-ups. And then I really wanted to actually dig deep and be a good songwriter. I really cared about it. I mean, I always had, but I really had to sort of consciously choose that I was going to write songs that I thought were going to be excellent. Mm-hmm. And so I think in that way, it kind of really forced me or made me excited to pull up my bootstraps and really try and become a storyteller songwriter, because I didn't always have my own stories to tell. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to write good songs. So I really kind of committed to trying to tell other people's stories, even if they were embellished or slightly fictionalized, to write good songs.
Was that a conscious decision of yours to move towards a more narrative style, or were you just writing and you realized, oh, wow, I am now writing in a new narrative style?
Well, I remember being, 26, 27. I'd been married for a few years. My husband and I bought a house. We were sort of seemingly, despite our lifestyle and the way we earned our living, I thought my life was relatively settled and safe and happy. And so I didn't have a lot of sort of upheaval to draw on. And so I think for a while it was kind of weird, like, what the fuck am I going to write about if I'm not writing about, the things that people associate me with, or the things that maybe I've had success in writing about in the past. And so I do remember feeling a little bit trepidatious about how I was going to continue to sort of sound like me and also create work that was actually going to be of any interest to anyone else. And so I remember the record I'm sort of thinking about right now is Asking for Flowers, which was my third record. And I remember there was lots of little moments on there that were pieces of me very directly. Like I have a song called near the end of that record called Scared at Night. That was a story about my dad. My first cat had died. I was maybe like 10. and I loved my cat, and my cat died suddenly, and my dad comes home from work, and, I'm this, sobbing little girl. And my dad told me this story about how, being a farm kid, he had to actually put one of his cats down once that he had accidentally hurt, and then had to put down his cat. And I think he was telling me to let me know it's okay that, animals do die. And maybe he was also trying to tell me, like, in the big picture, you got off easy, kid, But that song, I wrote this song called Scared at Night about, these sort of huge life moments of my young life that my dad was the vehicle for me learning. And there are still times probably where, like, I play that song and I still am on the edge of, welling up, because there's these very intense emotions that come with that those kinds of memories. But,
man, that, you have no idea how much esteem I now have for your dad. That is the ultimate dad power move, to tell a child with a dead cat that he once had to murder his with his bare hands. That's like the ultimate.
Well, he shot it. But anyway.
Before we move on, I would be remiss. You mentioned that you did a fair bit of touring with one of the greatest American narrative songwriters to ever live, John Prine, dearly departed John Prine. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask for a favorite memory or two that you have of touring and knowing John Prine.
Well, full disclosure, I didn't know John very well. I was so fortunate to have opened for him for maybe about 10 days in the southern U.S. in theaters. And I recall his son, actually, his wife and his son were quite young at the time. I mean, that's 15 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, they seemed young. They seemed like I swear he had a 4-year-old. Anyways, and he was so gracious. And I was so, my lasting memory of him was, a guy who had, gone through this sort of really significant cancer treatment. And I remember seeing him and thinking, wow, I really cut away a lot of his neck and throat, in his surgery to be able to beat cancer. And I was so moved by, he never seemed severe. He always maintained that level of humanity and sort of silliness and dryness in his humor that I relished so much as a young songwriter, hearing songs for the first time of John's. And he was exactly the person you imagine singing them and writing them. And he was always calm and gracious. And about 2 years ago, I was supposed to play a few shows with him in Western Canada, opening for him. And about a week before the shows, he actually had to cancel because he was under risk of imminent stroke, and so they decided to keep him home and treat him and just watch him. And I guess he probably had a few medical treatments to resolve that issue. And we were going to do them this year. They were just rebooked for this year. And it was one of those things, you never know when an opportunity's going to pass you by, or canceled or postponed plans are going to happen or not happen.
Yeah.
But I just remember him being as honest in his presentation of himself as you feel his songs were. Mm.
Kathleen stepped away from music a few years ago and opened up a coffee shop called Quitters. She needed some time away. She needed to focus on her mental health, and it sounds like she needed to move past some self-conceptions that were holding her back. There's a lovely poem by Elizabeth Bishop which speaks to that internal process, entitled The Imaginary Iceberg. We'd rather have the iceberg than the ship, although it meant the end of travel. although it stood stock still like cloudy rock and all the sea were moving marble. We'd rather have the iceberg than the ship. We'd rather own this breathing plain of snow, though the ship's sails were laid upon the sea as the snow lies undissolved upon the water. O solemn floating field, are you aware an iceberg takes repose with you, and when it wakes may pasture on your snows? This is a scene a sailor'd give his eyes for. The ship's ignored. The iceberg rises and sinks again, its glassy pinnacles correct elliptics in the sky. This is a scene where he who treads the boards is artlessly rhetorical. The curtain is light enough to rise on finest ropes that airy twists of snow provide. The wits of these white peaks spar with the sun. Its weight the iceberg dares upon a shifting stage and stands and stares. This iceberg cuts its facets from within. Like jewelry from a grave, it saves itself perpetually and adorns only itself. Perhaps the snows which so surprise us lying on the sea. Goodbye, we say goodbye. The ship steers off, where waves give in to one another's waves, and clouds run in a warmer sky. Icebergs behoove the soul, both being self-made from elements least visible, to see them so. Fleshed, fair, erected, indivisible. Well, I don't know how deep you are into the press cycle for this new record yet, so this next question, you might be tired of answering this already, but it is the elephant in the room. A couple years ago, 8 years ago to be exact, you took off some time from making music to open up a coffee shop. I always joke with my wife when I get fed up with making money in music that I'm going to quit, but that the only business that I wouldn't go into besides music is food service, because it's the only crazier business to go into. But you did it, which I have much respect for. Can you talk to me a little bit about the reasons leading into your hiatus, and then how you chose opening a coffee shop as your new vocation at the time?
My marriage fell apart. I made a record sort of in the fallout of that marriage breaking up. I did it with my new boyfriend, who was, for better lack of a way of saying it, one of the most popular indie musicians out there, probably still to this day. And he produced the record with me. And I think I was so determined that I was going to keep going through divorce and through the loss of that stability and that partnership into, this new whirlwind experience where I kind of got to see behind the curtain of what somebody whose star is just blowing up looks like and feels like, and being an audience to that, like in the front row, literally at the Grammys in the front row with your boyfriend. It was an incredible few years, and I was really determined that I was going to make a great record that showed that I wasn't a country artist. And I say that because it was one of the thorns in my side that I really resented. Was I would have this sort of, like, I was a Canadian, and yeah, I had a real affinity for American songwriting and American culture. And I would say, Nashville is kind of the new epicenter of the North American, especially the sort of roots and Americana music scene. But I had a real connection with Austin, Texas, and was always my connection was with the community in Austin, and I was sort of always determined that I was going to show that I had other tricks up my sleeve. Mm-hmm. And Justin Vernon, who produced the record, Bon Iver, he was a wonderful musical partner during that experience, because he really allowed me to leave that. He really allowed me to leave my sort of community of roots-based toolboxes. And here's a guy who has not a single bias in music. That's the one incredible thing about this guy, is that he would work with Kanye West, and he would then work with this person, and he loved folk music, and he loved rap, and he loved, new country. Like, he would crank everything, and he never had a bias. And it was such a nice change from somebody who felt pigeonholed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made this record, and I was really incredibly proud of it. And I recall going to Europe for like the first month that the new record was out. And I had been so determined that I was going to break that mold of this like country artist, especially in Europe. If you have any kind of rootsy leaning, you're put in the country realm.
Yeah.
And, I remember going over to the UK, having done some setup work there and this and that. And I walked into an HMV, which is the music chain that's still actually quite popular in the UK. And not only was I not in, the wall of music that included, Sharon Van Etten and the War on Drugs, and who I consider to be my contemporaries.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the back with a new record in a country section. And not only was I in the country section, but they labeled my music Kathleen Edwards Bon Iver. And I was just like, my heart broke. I mean, it's fucking hilarious now that I think about it. It's like, you could have not stomped on me harder, but like, not with intention and stuff. But
yeah.
And I was just like, fuck, it doesn't matter how hard I work, I'm not going to be able to be in control of this thing that's eating away at me. And it really ate away at me. And, I shouldn't have let it, but I did. And I burned out, and I was clinically depressed. I didn't know it. And then I really was unwell. I really lost my joy of playing music. And I got a great doctor who was able to say, yeah, you're fucking clinically depressed. Mm-hmm. And I was like, great. That helps figure out why I cannot seem to get out of this rut that I'm in. And I came home and took the time to get well, and I started feeling well again. And the idea of just going back to the drawing board on writing music, knowing that I was a narrative songwriter, knowing that really all I had to draw on was what the last few years of my life had been, I thought, that's the last thing I want to write about. Yeah. I just don't want to draw on any of this. I want to get over it. I want to move on. I want to turn a page. And if I'm going to sit here and try and write, I'm not going to be able to do that. So I took a big break, and I just thought, my first job was working in a coffee shop. I loved it. It was part of the reason I became part of my local music scene. I'd seen every coffee shop from Stockholm to Chicago. I loved coffee culture. I loved space making. And I moved to this small, sleepy little suburban town where there just was not anything. And I thought, all right, let's try this.
That's wonderful.
I did.
Well, now that you have a new record out, it's easy to look at that period of your life as like, well, she just took a hiatus and she got well, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and that's great. But was there a moment in the middle of that when you didn't know if you were going to make more music that did that kind of provoke anxiety in a way? Like, wow, I let this thing go. It's never going to come back to me. I mean, what was your mentality like while that hiatus was actually going on?
Relief.
Oh, wow.
Relief. And that, it's funny, I have a guitar player, one of my long-standing guitar players has sort of said, I'm out. I love you, wish you the best, but I'm out. And I reached back out to him a few days ago, and I said, I wanted to circle back just to see, lots happened in the last 6 months. Do you still feel that way? And he said, ever since I told you I wanted to step away, I've just felt a huge sense of relief. And I said, well, then you made the right decision, because I can relate. Yeah. And I felt relief because I felt that there were all these people that I was going to disappoint. The people who worked with me as management, booking agents, musicians. I mean, my parents, I remember them saying to me, I said, I showed up, I was like, I'm going to open this cafe and this place came for rent and I'm going to do it. And it's blah, blah, this and that. And they've stopped and said, but you're so good at music. And it's like, yeah, I fucking hate it right now. It's not something I can be good at right now, and thank you, but it can't be everything, and it had become everything. It consumed me. And it was just a huge relief. All it did was give me permission to not be singularly identified within myself or by anyone else as somebody who's a singer,
Yes.
It's a wonderful privilege to say that that's something I've done in my life, but it can't be your only, it can't be the only cards in your hand. It loses its shine. You need to have other things in your life.
You really do. I'm a huge proponent of that. I think in your 20s, it's kind of helpful to have a monomania for your job and you really throw yourself into it. But the problem with that, when things inevitably don't go that well, is that 100% of your identity gets blown up instead of like 30% of it or 20% of it, which is, you can kind of deal with.
Oh, that's such a great way of saying it. I mean, yeah, I really felt like I was betraying myself by quitting music, even though I felt like I was betraying myself even more by staying in it. But it's true, you're not walking away from everything if you just have other things in your life. I mean, the whole joke, of course, of being a musician is that everyone says, well, better have a plan B. And I'm like, cool. Now I have a coffee shop and I'm like, well, plan B is actually music because I make a hell lot of more money doing that than I ever did selling a cup of coffee.
Right. Yeah, and giving people the Wi-Fi code for free.
Yeah. I'm in the office rental business with a side of coffee.
Yeah, exactly. So now as this hiatus comes to an end, I picture you as the musician version of the Roman general Hiatus at his plow with Emperor, meeting him in the field and asking him to come back for another war. That's you. You're in your coffee shop there in Stittsville. You're at your plow. And, someone not from Rome, but from Nashville sends, tell me how this hiatus came to an end and tell me how this new album of yours was born.
Well, a lot of long and hard hours in a cafe gave me food for thought, no pun intended. It gave me time to appreciate and have perspective about the things I had accomplished, because I felt like such a failure when I stopped, and I was able to rebuild my sense of, wow, I actually did something really special and good. And so when you're working these long days and you're on your feet, and you have this other thing that you could go and do, I guess it was just the right timing. And this woman named Maren Morris who lives in Nashville, she's obviously hilariously had one of the largest pop hits of the last 5 years on mainstream radio. And she also then, was hugely successful in her own right as sort of an artist in the country world. And I guess she must have been a fan of Thaler or maybe back to me. And so her manager reached out and I thought, okay, a trip to Nashville to co-write something I've never really done, with somebody I don't really know. What's the worst that can happen? I mean, is that I don't have anything to offer, and I'll try. Mm-hmm. And so I did, and it was a great couple of days. And so I met Maren at a third person's house, and the third person involved in this 2-day writing session is a guy named Ian Fitchuk, who at the time had also just finished producing a record for Casey Musgraves with one of his musical partners, Daniel Tashian. And who knew that was going to, well, of course, the story is so wonderful that they ended up having such an incredible few years of success from working on that album together. But Maren and I, she was just lovely. And I brought a few ideas to the table. One of them stuck. it ended up making her record. We made the song hers. She made it hers in her own way. And it was just wonderfully validating. And I came home from those few days, not knowing what the song would do, but I came home feeling like I had just kind of gotten out, I'd sort of gone into the backyard and dug up that little treasure chest that I'd buried for a rainy day. And I was like, oh, there you are. And I was just excited about music. It just felt like such a natural state of being. Regardless of the outcome of my work with Marin, I just thought, oh, right, there you are. That's who you are. This comes so easily to you. And, running a cafe is really hard work. There's a lot of aspects of my personality and tools that I don't have in my toolbox for being an organized, small business operator. And I worked my ass off. I still do. It's been a hugely learning experience that I've loved. But going down to Nashville really sort of let that spark sort of out. And I was like, right, that's you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
And then I just thought about how I wanted to, I just thought, well, what do I want to do? And I thought, well, I'd like to start over. So I kind of did, and some of the people that I've been working with for all the years leading up, we all parted ways, and I feel like that happened quite amicably and with gratitude to new beginnings. And then I found Dual Tone and a manager down in the States, and it's just been a really fun adventure ever since.
How do you think your writing, particularly for this album, how has your writing evolved over the last 20 years from Failure and that original EP that you recorded yourself until now? Has it changed?
Well, that original EP that you referenced called Building 55, one of my biggest influences growing up was, as a young girl, a young woman, was Ani DeFranco. So I just ripped off Ani DeFranco for the first, 5 years of my existence of playing guitar and singing songs. I mean, I once entered a talent competition and I played an Ani DeFranco song. She was my hero. But Tom Petty was an equal hero. So it just, I eventually they evolved into sort of a more roots leaning thing. I mean, we are naturally inclined to emulate our influences and our heroes, because there's something that happens when we listen to something and it moves us, which is it becomes part of our, it becomes part of us, I guess. And so I really don't think that anything I do is terribly imaginative. I just think I'm small pieces of all these influences that live inside me, and they create my singular voice. So, how has my writing changed? I worry less about trying to be, some kind of standalone, unique, Dylan-esque, standalone, I guess. I don't worry about that stuff. I just figured it was good enough for 15 years to put out 4 records and tour, regardless of the capacity with which I did that. I'm just going to listen to what I like and go with that.
And did you feel a weight off your shoulders? I mean, as you said earlier, in a way, running the cafe, you were like, well, music's my plan B now, ironically enough. Was there a weight off your shoulders writing-wise, just because you felt like, well, if this doesn't work, it doesn't matter because I have something else to turn to?
Yeah, entirely. Like, neither of these two things owns me, and that's nice. That's a nice thing. And I don't say that with like a bank account full of money. I don't have a lot of financial stability, but I'm just going to keep plugging away and know that I've been lucky. And if I just, keep trying, I'll still make a living doing one of these two things. But I don't, I don't think I've ever been someone who just could rest on my laurels. Like, I live in a town where there's a lot of public servants. There's a ton of public servants in Ottawa. And what's interesting about this time, this COVID thing, is I've realized how incredibly vulnerable being an entrepreneur and being a small business owner and being the person who is the creator of your own income really are. We are incredibly vulnerable right now in this type of situation. And public servants are, they have a lot of security in their jobs for the most part. They've had to make adjustments too, but their checks are still coming every 2 weeks.
Right.
And, but I could never do that job. And I would never want to do that job. And I entirely respect people's course of, their choices to do those types of jobs. They're necessary and needed, but they don't speak to me. And, if that means that I have to live in a certain lifestyle because of the choice, now that I'm old enough to realize, I'm not going to be a pop star. I'm not going to make $1 million. I'm not going to be Sarah McLachlan and have a house in Vancouver and in Whistler and in Tofino. And not to suggest that she didn't earn every single penny that she made in her successful
I know what you
run.
mean. Yeah.
But I don't live in that fantasy world. I'm so lucky with what I have, and I'm, I'm just gonna. Artists sort of have that. We have that ingrained thing in our DNA that we're just naturally incapable of really sort of sitting around and letting other people make art for us. We're art makers too. We're creators in a certain way, and maybe that's making a coffee shop, and maybe that's making an album, maybe that's starting up anything. There's a lot of crossover in that, and it's I don't rest on I'm going to give this music thing all my heart and soul like I did the first time around. I just am less worried this time around about thinking that that other people giving me accolades or that a certain kind of financial blowback is going to sort of validate whether or not I'm good at this. I've spent 5 years in a cafe where a lot of people have said some really nice things to me about what my work meant to them, and it's enough for an entire lifetime of kindness, and it's validated some of the hardships I feel like I've undergone in my commitment to being an artist. And it's a wonderful privilege to say that I do this, and I also earn every fucking penny that I made.
Well, I think that is an astonishingly wise point of view to have there, and I think that this was a really illuminating chat. Thank you so much, Kathleen Edwards, for being a part of the Working Songwriter.
Thanks, Joe. It was really nice talking to you.
That's our show for this week. It was brought to you by Bandzoogle, built by musicians and for musicians. Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Kathleen Edwards' forthcoming album is entitled Total Freedom, and it will be available in August on Dual Tone Records. If before we meet again you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.